Good evening. Anybody hear me? Good. Good evening. My name is John Mitchum. I am the chair of the Department of History here at Duquesne, and on behalf of my colleagues and on behalf of the McAnulty College and Graduate School of Liberal Arts, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 54th Annual History Forum. This is our signature event that we all look forward to every year, and we took this past year off due to COVID, so clearly we're very excited to see a packed house as we all sort of inch back to a return to normalcy. The History Forum is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, lecture series at Duquesne University. And I spent this afternoon, as good historians do, going back through old issues of the Duquesne Duke, trying to find out when the first History Forum was and what its topic was. It was actually on November 2nd, 1966, with a topic, actually, on Latin America. 1966, with Lyndon Johnson, this is before most of you were born, of course, Lyndon Johnson was president. The Sound of Music won the Academy Award that year. The National Hockey League finally approved Pittsburgh to have a franchise, which ultimately becomes the Penguins. And inventions such as Cool Whip and Doritos made their appearance on grocery store shelves. The format of the History Forum has changed over time. It started out largely being a panel of speakers talking about a common subject and has gradually kind of evolved into the current format. But one element remains the same, and that is our goal of providing a public-facing event that brings a prominent historian to campus to speak on a topic of wide interest. It's our way in the Department of History of engaging with the wider community and of celebrating with Pittsburgh our shared fascination of and appreciation for the past. In the last decade, the department has based its forum around historical anniversaries, such as, for example, the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landings or the centenary of the United States entry into the First World War. This year, we decided to look a little bit further back, 500 years back, to the anniversary of the events that led to the fall of the Aztec Empire. And so to jumpstart tonight's event, I'd like to introduce the director of the 2021 History Forum, Dr. Jay Dwyer. Jay is a historian of modern Latin America with a focus on the political, diplomatic, and social history of 20th century Mexico. He earned his PhD from the University of Illinois and joined Duquesne University in fall 2001. His first book, The Agrarian Dispute, The Expropriation of American-Owned Land in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, was published by Duke University Press in 2008 and was awarded the Alfred B. Thomas Book Award by the Southeastern Council for Latin American Studies. He is currently working on a project that looks at the environmental impact of foreign industries along the Mexico-US border, specifically in the borderland regions of Baja and California. From 2013 to 2019, Jay served as the chair of the Department of History, where he engaged in a number of important reforms, including creating the department's first paid internships and creating international travel grants for graduate students. Probably the smartest, wisest act that Jay engaged in as chair was hiring me. So thank you, Jay. As chair of the department, and on behalf of all my colleagues, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Jay for serving in this leadership post this year as director of the forum. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Jay.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the History Forum. The History Forum didn't happen last year because of COVID, and so it means a lot to the department that we're putting on our signature event again this year, and doing so live, and live streamed, and so forth. First, an important thanks to Kelly Kowalski, the department's administrative assistant, who was instrumental in bringing about a dozen or so different things together, from food to live streaming to this room to making sure we have tequila, which just recently arrived at the bar about 10 minutes ago. But without Kelly's help, honestly, this event wouldn't take place. So Kelly, thank you very much. As John noted, the topic of the forum tonight is the Spanish conquest or defeat of the Aztec Empire in 1521. Speaking for myself as a modern historian, looking back on the last 500 years of world history, I would say this event is probably in the top 5 for shaping not only the entire history of the Americas, but European history and world history as well. That's how important it is. So I've been thinking for a number of years, in fact, since 2003, who to bring to campus in 2021. So for 18 years, I've been thinking about this. Or actually, I personally decided 18 years ago. I shared that idea with our speaker tonight, Dr. Matthew Restall, last year, and I shared it with the history department a couple of years ago. So it kind of begs the question, well, why Dr. Matthew Restall to give this speech tonight on this important historical event? Might, help to know a little bit about him. And I met him in 2003 at a conference in Monterrey, Mexico, sort of by accident. I was having dinner with a mutual friend and colleague of ours named Dr. Ben Vinson. And Ben said to me at dinner one night, 10 o'clock or so, hey, what are you doing after dinner? And I said, well, I'm beat. I'll probably just go back to my room, crash and stuff like that. And Ben says to me, oh, come on, go with me over to the hotel bar. You can meet a friend of mine, colleague named Matt Restall. And, like most academics, we want to know who we're meeting professionally first. And I'm like, okay, so what does he do? And he says, colonial period. Well, I'm a modern Mexican historian. I don't necessarily interact with the colonialists too often, but maybe there's something there. And I said, okay, what period of colonial? And he said, conquest. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's really going back in time. So I'm like, I don't know, Ben, I'm really tired. And then he says, oh, but he's really funny and he's really sarcastic. You'll like him. And I'm still kind of shrugging my shoulders. And then he throws in, he's British. And maybe Ben understood that I have a British wife. I know he knew that at the time, and that would give Dr. Restall additional cachet. And then I'm still pretty hesitant. And then Ben Vinson says, he'll be with this guy, Bill Beasley. And for everybody in this room, there's probably only about 4 people who understand that Bill Beasley and why. Once I heard that, I immediately said, yeah, I'm in, I'll go. I want to meet Bill Beasley. Who was Bill Beasley? He is a senior Latin American historian of modern Latin American history, closer to the eras that I work in. I was an assistant professor at the time. It would make sense to meet Bill Beasley and do some networking in some way, shape, or form. But I also wanted to meet Bill Beasley because, besides being this phenomenal historian of 19th century Mexico, he also has a bit of a reputation of enjoying himself at conferences. So that's kind of what led me to meet Matthew for the first time, was more so I wanted to meet someone else. And when Ben and I left the restaurant about 10:30 at night, we went back to the hotel bar and we found Doctors Matthew Restall, Bill Beasley, and about 2 or 3 other people enjoying themselves. And honestly, it took about 30 seconds for Ben and I to realize that while he and I were eating solid Mexican food like enchiladas or whatever else was on the menu, this group of historians was having a liquid dinner instead. And probably tequila and cerveza were the entrees and the sides. And they were having a great conversation. Nobody was talking about work or the research they do or anything like that. So that's always really refreshing. And so I began to wonder, after some brief introductions and finding out that Dr. Restall's right here at Penn State, well, not right here, but 2.5 or 3 hours away, I started thinking, yeah, let's look into him and find out his area of specialization and maybe get him here at some point in some time. A few days later, I was on a plane back in Pittsburgh in my office, looking at the Penn State University History Department website, pulling him up, And seeing his vita and just being blown away by the amount of scholarship and research that he has conducted, even then, and that was 2003, and where he is today. So I was really glad I wanted to meet somebody else because I got to meet him instead. Who is Matthew Restall? He received his bachelor's degree from Oxford University and his doctorate from the University of California at Los Angeles. He is the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of History and Anthropology at Penn State University. His publication record is extensive. Somewhere close to 30 books have been published as either monographs, co-authored books, edited volumes, and even textbooks. Two of his books have won prestigious awards, one as recently as 2018, which has a lot to do with tonight's talk, when Montezuma met Cortez, and then back in 2009, a book on the Black Middle, about the relationship between Africans who were brought from Africa to colonial Mexico, and how they engaged with indigenous peoples and Spaniards alike. He's won numerous fellowships, including an NEH Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. He's been a fellow at Princeton University's Institute for Advanced Studies. He is now, at this point in time, a senior co-editor of the Hispanic American Historical Review. What is that? It is the most important journal in for the study of the history of Latin America as a whole. For about 9 years, he was the co-editor of the journal Ethnohistory. He was the founding editor of a series entitled Latin American Originals, which has produced over the years a number of books on Latin American primary sources for classroom use. He was the past president of the American Society of Ethnohistory, and in short, his vita is extensive, and I could be up here for the entire length of the forum, and I still wouldn't get through it. In the 21 years that I've been at Duquesne University, we have never had a speaker with such a large, monumental, I would say, scholarly reputation and production. He is, not only in this country, but in Latin America and as well as in Europe, probably amongst the most important voices in understanding Latin American history, especially during that important encounter, for lack of a better term, between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. I really could go on, but of course I won't, because we want to hear what he has to say. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Restall as our speaker for the 2021 History Forum.
I don't know if you remembered, Jay, but that evening ended with you and me actually carrying Bill Beasley. I don't mean helping, I mean literally carrying him into a taxi. Are we still young enough to be able to carry someone into? I think we are tonight. Yeah, I feel like we're available. I'm just. Yeah, the evening is young. Thank you for that absurdly generous introduction. I feel like from now on, for me, it's kind of downhill. So I guess I'm. No, on the contrary. This is the first time that I have been in a room like this, talking to an audience like this since, I think it was March the 15th, 2020. So you all know exactly what happened right after that. And that was in New Orleans, or as we say in England, New Orleans. So this feels sort of wonderfully familiar and kind of unfamiliar all at the same time. I am so happy to be here. This is great, and I really appreciate all of you coming out, and everybody who's contributed to making this possible. That makes the rather provocative title, which I hope you'll forgive. almost hysterically provocative title. Seems slightly less hysterical. And I'm now going to begin. The talk has a series of parts that are numbered. I'm now going to begin where I hope none of you expected that I would begin. So if you know what that is, there's a little in-joke here, which is that the intro to the song is about 3.5 minutes long. So what I hope is there's at least one person in the room who is sitting there going, is he going to stand in silence for 3.5 minutes waiting for the vocal to begin? Well, you're going to have to go play it on your iPhones and your earbuds afterwards. In 1975, the Canadian folk singer and rock star Neil Young included on his latest album a song titled Cortés the Killer. In Young's telling, the Spanish conquistador, Hernando Cortés, is more of a weapon than a man, coming dancing across the water with his galleons and guns, the medium by which the idyllic society of the Aztecs is destroyed. What a killer. Sorry, I know, you could just put your earbuds in right now and listen, it's okay, I won't be offended. When released in Spain, the first pressing of the album omitted Cortés the Killer, allegedly banned by Francisco Franco's censors. But even when the general died later that year, and the song was restored as the album's penultimate track, as you can see here on the track listing, it was retitled, as you can see here, this is the Spanish release, Cortés, Cortés. The irony of this political sensitivity to the Cortesian legend, 4.5 centuries after those galleons and guns danced across the water, is that Young's song isn't really about the so-called conquest of Mexico. The song's focus is Montezuma and his world as a paradise lost and a metaphor for the romantic paradise taken from Young when a relationship with a woman that he was seeing ended. Today, as we come to the end of the quincentennial of the great Spanish-Aztec War of 1519 to 1521, those associations of romance and glory are as alive as ever, as reflected in these album cover versions of that song. That is, the Spanish invasion of Mexico as a glorious achievement defended this very month by Spanish politicians and conservative intellectuals, and as a gendered encounter, a Spanish-Aztec romantic conquest, symbolized by a supposedly real romance between Cortés and his indigenous interpreter, Malintzin. So Young's song worked and still works as a metaphor of love and loss, even to the extent of unnerving those Spanish officials in 1975. Because the events in Mexico of 500 years ago have been narrated in a certain way, repeatedly and consistently throughout the Atlantic world ever since. But here's the catch. That deeply rooted and familiar story is wrong. There was no romance, no glory. The popular story is a set of lies built upon one big lie at its center, masking the grim reality of a brutal colonial war. A few hundred Spanish horsemen did not miraculously seize an empire of millions, as shown in this 17th century painting. See, the album cover on the left is a version of a famous 17th century painting. Nor did Aztec princesses swoon symbolically in the arms of warriors or conquistadors. So how did all this happen? That is, what lies were told? Why? How did they take hold and spread and survive? And why does it matter today? Sir, here in my house, there has grown up since it was very little, a tiger. And it has turned out to be the most handsome animal that has ever been seen. For in addition to being very pretty, it's very tame and walks freely about the house and eats at the table, whatever it is given, wrote Cortés from Tenochtitlan in 1527. It was not yet called Mexico City, to his father, Martin, in Spain. And I was reading a translation of that letter that's written in Cortez's hand. It's in the archives in Seville in Spain. He continued, "And it therefore seems to me that he could go on the ship very safely and will escape the fate of so many that have died. I implore your mercy to give it to his majesty, for in truth, it is booty to be gifted." Literally, es pieza para dar, a piece to be presented. Along with their letter and the tiger, Cortez packed the ship with precious stones and metals, including gold to pay his lawyers. And as with the ships sent before it, this one carried Mesoamerican featherwork and cloth, animal skins, and young slaves. The following year, Cortez himself crossed the ocean. Another fortune in plunder accompanied him, as did scores of Nahuas, Tainos, and other indigenous Americans, almost all young women and children, all enslaved during and after the Spanish-Aztec War. Their destiny was to serve conquistador veterans in their households or to be sold in the slave markets of Seville, to die an ocean away from their homelands. Also accompanying Cortez was his eldest son, named Martin after his grandfather. The child was 6 years old. His mother was Malintzin, or Doña Marina, usually called Malinche today. The polyglot Nahua interpreter who had acquired status during the war. In 1519, she had herself been a piece of booty to be gifted. Her boy, whom she would never see again, was deposited by Cortez at court to be one of the many pages to the future King Philip II. So little Martin was also a piece to be presented. His was a destiny for the era to return in adulthood to Mexico, where colonial officials would falsely accuse him of treason and rack him and waterboard him until he was permanently crippled. So there is horror here, lurking between the lines of text and image, a different story to be told. To get some sense of how to tell the tale differently in the all too brief time that we have, follow me now from these little slivers of evidence that I've presented to you, from Cortez's tiger and his half-indigenous children to people and places in different centuries before circling back to Montezuma's lions and tigers. That's the tequila that he was referring to. There's none left, I'm afraid. Let us jump then from Mexico in 1527 to the quaint little American town of Columbia, Tennessee, where I went to see this house, the Polk Home and Museum, and this painting, which hangs in the house. This bad hombre is, of course, our plunderer of tigers, Cortez. Among all the mediocre posthumous portraits of him, why is this one significant? Well, before it was taken to Columbia, Tennessee, the painting hung in the foyer of the now demolished Polk Mansion in Nashville. And there you can see that picture taken in 1891 actually shows the picture hanging on the wall there. It was still there in 1891 when Sarah Childress Polk died. She had brought it from the White House back in January of 1849 upon becoming the outgoing First Lady. Thus, for the last year of the Polk presidency, the painting was in the White House lobby, where the First Lady made a point of showing it to all visitors. She liked to remark that the US invasion of Mexico was one of her husband's greatest achievements, quote, among the most important events in the history of this country. On the very day that Sarah Polk hung the portrait in her Nashville mansion, she learned of the death of General William Worth from the same cholera epidemic that would actually soon kill her husband. Worth, a hero of the US victory in Mexico, claimed he saw the painting in the Hospital de Jesus in Mexico City, commissioned a copy, and sent it in 1848 to the First Lady as a gift. having studied the painting, I became convinced that Worth, in fact, looted it. Either way, the general was struck by what he saw as powerful parallels between the invasions of Mexico in 1519 and 1847. And he wasn't the only one. US soldiers carried copies of William Prescott's The Conquest of Mexico on their march from Veracruz to Mexico City. The war made that book, published a few years before, a bestseller. And Prescott, opposed at first to this war of naked aggression, changed his mind when the royalties began to pour in. Other writers rushed conquest-themed novels, romances, and histories to press, all comparing Scott to Cortez, both having invaded, quote, the same most magnificent of valleys with equal daring intrepidity. US soldiers wrote home that they were walking in the footsteps of the great Cortez, and Americans started calling their war the Second Conquest. Scott asked Prescott to follow his book with one on the Second Mexican War. Just a few years after Scott and Worth styled themselves the new conquistadors, marching into the halls of Montezuma, leaving a permanent imprint on the American imperial imagination. Another visitor to Mexico City was struck by the imprint of conquest and empire on the urban landscape. Constantino Brumidi, an Italian painter of religious art, had been brought from Rome in 1854 to paint an altarpiece in the cathedral. And while in Mexico City, he frequently visited and sketched the historical sites and monuments that fascinated him, such as that Hospital de Jesus and the great Aztec calendar stone, which in Brumidi's day was exhibited inside the cathedral. Well, Brumidi's next commissions were in the United States, and by the end of the 1850s, he had been hired to paint the interior of the Great Dome of the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. Designed in 1859 by Brumidi, but only finished in 1953, the frieze of American history curves around the base of the dome, 58 feet from the floor. The third of the frieze's 19 historical scenes incorporates Brumidi's rendering of that Aztec calendar stone as a backdrop to this. With a tilt of the head and a gesture of the hand, Montezuma capitulates to Cortez in the US Capitol. The surrender is unambiguous and gendered. The Spanish conquistadors are armed and advancing. The Aztecs are adorned with feathers, not weapons. The men attired similarly to the women, one of whom seems frightened, another is on her knees. The scene is a link in the chain of events marking American history, from Columbus's first landing to the discovery of gold in California. And this third scene is echoed on the other side of the dome by the 15th scene. So as you stand there and look up, if you completely turn around, you see this one. A depiction of US troops taking possession of Mexico City in 1847. The parallel is inescapable. General Scott is Cortez, and General Santa Anna is Montezuma. The two acts of surrender in Mexico City echo, illuminate, and legitimize each other, representing resonant moments in the American march of progress and civilization. So the frieze in the Capitol illustrates the simple fact that the encounter of Cortez and Montezuma was and is still remembered, represented, and reinscribed as a surrender. So the clash of civilizations, the conquest wars, the protracted process of colonization, all are eclipsed and elided into a single symbolic moment. For Cortez and the West, that moment is providentially triumphal. For Montezuma and Native America, it is one of voluntary capitulation, an acceptance of fate. Now, because the frieze is a circle, these mirrored pairs are also connected where the story of America begins and ends. As Brumidi miscalculated by 30 feet, later artists were able to update America's history to include the Wright brothers, flying towards Columbus, separated by an allegorical female America. You see her standing there. Ubiquitous in the Atlantic world for the past 5 centuries. America, as a desirable woman, is an icon far less innocuous than she might seem. Sometimes topless, sometimes indigenous, the US Capitol's millions of annual visitors can gaze up and see her atop the building itself before entering the rotunda, where they can see her tying together that tale of American progress. The impression of the monumental weight of a predestined sequence of great events, of facts carved in stone, is irresistible. Yet the frieze isn't carved in stone. It's a mural, painted in grisaille, a fresco of whites and browns designed to look like stone. Likewise, the frieze depicts a series of encounters that actually took place, but those encounters are styled and juxtaposed to promote a greater message. The frieze's use of content, like its technique of composition, is an artful trick. We have a choice. We can let ourselves be fooled and accept Montezuma's surrender to Cortez, the gendered surrender of Native America to the West, as facts carved in stone. Or we can open our eyes to the spectacular trickery of a lie that has lived for 5 centuries, surviving like a virus as it moves from image to image, page to page. Let's jump now from Washington, D.C., where Cortez's portrait once hung in the White House, where Montezuma still surrenders to him in the Capitol Dome, back to the hospital, the Hospital de Jesus in Mexico City, visited by occupying generals Worth and Scott and by that Italian artist, Brumidi. A version of the portrait they saw still hangs in the office of the director of the hospital. This is not a very professional picture of it. The images at the bottom give you a sense of the original hospital, and through one of those doors there is supposedly, in a beam, is a box with the remains of Cortez that the Spaniards are trying to get back now. I doubt very much that anything in that box was actually Cortez. The reason for the amateur iPhone photograph of the painting at the top is because the only way I could get into the director's office was there was a cleaning woman generously let me in while he was at lunch and said, "Be quick because I'll get into trouble if he comes back." So I had to actually stand on his desk to get the picture. And that blurred figure, that's my wife, who's an art historian, who, you know, I tried to get her to take the picture because she knows what she's doing. She's like, "I'm not getting arrested over Cortez." The hospital is the longest functioning one in all of the Americas, the longest continuing functioning hospital in the Americas. It was founded in the 1520s by Cortez on the site where he first met the Hue Tlatoani Motekusomatsin Xocoyotzin. You can understand why I just refer to him as Montezuma. This is the shameless plug for the books. The dates at the bottom. It's actually not me that wants to put this meeting on the cover of all my books. That's the presses. So it looks like I'm writing the same book over and over. These are 2 different books. So this, one of the great meetings in human history, took place in a breathtaking setting, to which conquistador descriptions, let you just take that in for a minute, because that entire view that you see right now is completely covered now by Mexico City. The lake is gone. Conquistador descriptions, mostly variants on fear and wonder, could do no justice. A map was also sent to the Spanish king, likely drawn by an Aztec artist, but surviving only in this form, a kind of hybridized rendering engraved in Nuremberg in 1524. And I'm not going to talk about this right now, but take a look at that if you're not familiar with it. I'm going to come back to it later. Whereas Cortez found relatively few words in describing the city, he found many when it came to describing the conversation that took place at the meeting, when Montezuma apparently delivered an astonishing speech. Even more astonishingly, Cortez wrote it down verbatim a year later, as if he remembered all 530 words of its Spanish translation. The emperor allegedly revealed that generations ago, the Aztecs had been guided to Mexico by an ancient lord who then departed, but whose return they had awaited ever since. That return, Montezuma told Cortez, had now come, for the emperor believed the Spaniards to be descended from that ancient ruler, quote, "and therefore you may be sure that we will obey you and hold you as Lord." If there's not, that isn't astonishing as a statement. The fact that people believe that Montezuma actually said that to Cortez and continue to do so is even more astonishing to me. Montezuma, of course, said no such thing. Nor was he imprisoned soon afterwards, as the conquistadors claimed. The evidence is incontrovertible that he hosted the invaders as honored guests for 6 months, continuing to rule his empire until the restless conquistadors became violent. And in the ensuing conflict, most of the conquistadors died. The survivors murdered Montezuma before escaping the city. And his words of welcome, 21 months after he had given them, were deliberately distorted and restyled as a surrender speech, which then became the justificatory cornerstone of Spanish conquest, warfare, and colonial rule. So Cortez's lie became conquest gospel, surviving in written and visual form in Europe and in the Americas. And this one, painting that hung initially in Mexico, then in Spain, and then for several hundred years in a country house in England. Now it's in the Library of Congress and is beautifully displayed. Take us back to this. If the meeting as surrender is fake news, a whopping great fib, why did it take root so deeply in the 16th century and persist for half a millennium? Well, there are many reasons, and this is the part where historians giving talks say, you know, you have to read like 3 chapters of my book. It's 100 pages that I answer that question. It's a kind of a lazy way, but I can't summarize all of that in an efficient way. So there are many reasons for this that I'm not going to go into. But I am going to focus on one that I find particularly disturbing. Popular images of the gift of Malintzin to Cortez deny the violence that lay at the heart of the Spanish invasion, the war it provoked and its aftermath. Massacres of whole towns, mass enslavement of millions of women and children across Mesoamerica in the 1520s, 1530s, and 1540s. Now, this was not genocide in intent or in its hemispheric end result. This history matters in part because indigenous peoples and cultures persist to this day. But the combination of chaotic warfare, enslavement, and disease pandemics made the invasions effectively genocidal. The need to justify invasion thus became more, not less, pressing after the Aztec Empire's fall. The darkest side to this story, the trafficking in indigenous girls as sex slaves, needed to be covered up. The solution? Surrender. Not just of Montezuma, but surrender in a larger sense, gendered and metaphorical. We're accustomed to seeing the early modern era as one of imperial expansion, of conquest and colonization, terms that evoke images of big battles, church building, statecraft, cultural accommodations. But consider the experience of indigenous women. Hundreds of thousands of Calusa, Maya, Mixtec, Muisca, Nahua, Taino, Tocobaga, and others were grabbed on shores, dragged from homes, or simply presented to their Spanish, Portuguese, or English captors. Colonial Spanish laws often reveal not what was done in compliance with the law, but what had been done so widely that a legal attempt was made, usually in vain, to stop it. And such was the disturbing context behind a 1534 royal edict that indigenous slaves should be at least 14 years old. For the majority of enslaved indigenous women who appear in the imperial Spanish historical records testified that they were taken from their homes and sold when they were around or under 14. Accurate numbers of enslaved indigenous children are impossible to obtain for the very reason why their stories have been absent from the historical record. Their captivity was illegal under Spanish law. They were removed from their home communities, often taken thousands of miles away, and as children, they had no legal recourse and few ways to remember their origins. So the testimonies that have survived are important and deeply disturbing. For example, a Nahua woman simply named Isabel testified in the Spanish port city of Cadiz in 1554, when she was about 30 years old, that she was taken from her home village in Mexico, quote, and brought to Spain by way of Veracruz and Havana when I was about 15, still a child, a young girl, and the bosun sold me to another bosun. And he then sold me to a ship captain who was Portuguese, and we docked in Lisbon, where I was sold to a Portuguese slave merchant who brought me to Cadiz. Imagine the sheer terror experienced by Isabel and thousands of other girls taken by force from their homes, shipped around the Americas or across the ocean, distributed among men whose sensibilities had been made dull by years of combat and slave raiding. Most of the captives were younger than Isabel, more typically 12 years old, as was Malintzin. Some, like Malintzin and her fellow captives, were bartered by local indigenous rulers to secure goods, temporary peace, or the departure of the invaders, a trade consistently depicted in early modern accounts and prints as a happy affair. But a happy affair it was not. This was a multi-layered international system of deception that condemned children to years of abuse leading to an adulthood of slavery. The Annals of Tlatelolco, written in Nahuatl, noted that at the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, some women escaped from being seized and used as sex slaves, quote, by putting mud on their faces and dressing in rags, end quote. But 12-year-old Malintzin had no such option. She had to survive as best she could, even if that meant giving birth to her rapist child when she was 14, and then seeing that child taken from her and sent to Spain. It's the boy I mentioned at the beginning, while she was married off to a man chosen for her by her rapist. That this story was rewritten as a romance in the 19th century, and her role then judged as being traitorous in the 20th century surely only adds to the indignity and violence that she endured in her short life. Seeing through the mythologized Malintzin to the enslaved girl of the 1520s helps us to rescue from the erased past the other 19 girls transferred with her to the conquistadors, as well as the thousands of others who suffered similar fates. The point is not just that there's a larger story, but there's also a larger cultural phenomenon. That use of the female allegory to depict America, sorry, this was the image I wanted with that, often scantily clad and sexualized, often indigenous, spread as rapidly as the traditional narrative of the conquest of Mexico. So by the 17th century, it was a broadly European trope. And in the late 18th and 19th centuries, Romanticism deepened the metaphor of sexual surrender. The triumph of European civilization over indigenous barbarism was presented as fundamentally gendered, with a romance as the inevitable, irresistible core metaphor of that story. Now, we may recognize the romantic depiction of the conquest of Mexico as a fictional distortion ripe for parody. This is from the 70s. This is really a parody of popular Mexican calendar art. But we're not accustomed to seeing it as a hemispheric cover-up of uncomfortable historical truths, one that resonates in and atop the US Capitol of all places. Bountiful regal America figures may seem harmless, but they disguise disturbing histories as much as do those happy depictions of Malintzin and other indigenous women delivered into sexual slavery. Or paintings of Pocahontas redeemed by her acceptance of civilization. They matter because the lie of Montezuma's surrender and the metaphor of the sexual romantic surrender of America have supported each other for centuries and still resonate today. They matter because Malinche and Pocahontas can still be wielded as insults, even at the level of national and presidential politics in multiple countries. I said that there were many reasons why this fake news of Montezuma's surrender has survived for so long. And I dwelt for a while on one that I think is particularly important. Those reasons are detailed in too many pages in my book to summarize here, but let me just briefly mention some of the many ways in which this big lie went viral over the centuries. So as the centuries passed, the invented surrender story worked its way into histories in numerous languages. The Abbé Prévost, writing in French in the 1750s, spotted that the tale was, quote, highly suspect, but seemed otherwise, because he was found in so many books. And he then repeated it himself. We would call that confirmation bias. Meanwhile, the lie was immortalized in a play by Dryden, in an opera by Vivaldi, in paint and sculpture, and in the embrace by all Europe's empires, joined in the 19th century, as we've seen, by a young, expanding United States, of the fiction of indigenous welcome, surrender, capitulation, and the acceptance of Western superiority. Sorry, I'm trying to find an image that's missing. A fiction that was embraced so deeply that Westerners believed the racist absurdity that the natives took the likes of Cortez and Captain Cook to be gods. But it wasn't only Europeans who had their reasons to embrace the surrender lie as truth. The Aztec imperial dynasty survived as nobility, ruling locally, maintaining status, privileges, and wealth. Here's a beautiful letter written in Latin to the King of Spain. It's in the archives in Seville, by a nephew of Montezuma, christened Don Pablo Nazareo, in which he describes in Latin how his uncle not only willingly surrendered to Cortez, but also eagerly and immediately converted to Christianity. Another fact, did Nazareo really believe it or not? That's not clear, but he certainly describes it very convincingly, and there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever to suggest that that was true. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary. So Montezuma's descendants promoted themselves as loyal to the Spanish crown, beginning with his welcome to the invaders. The notion that the surrender must be true because indigenous people believed it was then strengthened centuries later by the discovery in the 19th century of the Florentine Codex and its increased availability in the 20th century. The Codex contained a version of Montezuma's speech in Nahuatl, repeating the traditional surrender theme, but couched in indigenous terms that were widely read as reflecting the true vision of the vanquished. In this version, Montezuma declares that Mexico's emperors have always awaited the prophesied return of their ancient sovereign. And now he tells Cortez, "It has come true. You have come. May our lords be arrived in the land." Thus, 20th century scholars, attempting to see the encounter through the lens of Aztec culture and to give Montezuma agency, only reinforced his status as blameworthy and blind. They embraced the detail that Montezuma identified Cortez with the returning man-god Quetzalcoatl. But that ancient Mesoamerican myth was added to the conquest story by friars like the Franciscan Bernardino de Sahagún, who had conceived, compiled, and even created much of the so-called Florentine Codex. No early source identifies Cortez with any Aztec god. No matter, the Quetzalcoatl myth became the solution to the riddle of Montezuma's surrender. So all through the 20th century, in numerous languages, Montezuma bowed to the will of the god-ruler Cortez Quetzalcoatl. The prevailing interpretation was captured in the catalog for the British Museum's 2002 Aztecs exhibition with the claim, wrong in every respect, that, quote, "The Aztec ruler welcomed Cortez with open arms, mistaking him for the hero king returning from the sea," end quote. In other words, the traditional narrative of surrender survived, but dressed in indigenous clothing. The Cortez-Montezuma meeting matters then not just as a great turning point in human history, but because its imperialist misrepresentation, the persistence of this big fat fib, underpins everything we thought was true about the histories of the Aztecs, of Spanish conquest, and, if it's not too much of a stretch, European colonization in the Americas. Discovery, conquest, and settlement as a triumphal inevitability, legitimated by a providential surrender, echoes throughout the last 5 centuries of world history, even resonating in modern multimedia renderings of that grand narrative. I'm kind of going a little crazy here, but just bear with me. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Harry Potter, with their racialized universes and cosmic victory of good over evil, civilization over barbarism. One man's lie became an official deception used to justify generations of warfare, centuries of colonization, the slaughter or enslavement of millions of people, all leading to today's world. What can stop the lie from persisting for another half millennium? Or another lie, another alternative fact taking its place? I promised that we would work our way back to lions and tigers, so to that end, let us turn to these monstrous doubles, Montezuma and Cortez, and consider some of the other key distortions and misrepresentations of the traditional story. So the meeting as a surrender creates a winner and a loser, mutually dependent. Cortez's own account of himself as winner was a cornerstone of the traditional narrative of the so-called conquest of Mexico, reinforced in the best-selling 1552 account by his secretary, commissioned by his son, essentially a work of historical fiction, retold repeatedly as fact, with Montezuma's surrender depicted as a predestined, notarized reflection of Cortez's God-blessed genius. The hagiographies of Cortez have yet to cease. The Franciscans virtually deified him. He's been Caesar, hero, founding father of a nation. Quote, chosen as a new Moses to free the Indian people, proclaimed the Spanish poet Gabriel Lasso de la Vega, asserting that God had Cortez and Luther born on the same day, an alternative fact repeated for centuries, even though they weren't, in fact, even born the same year. You understand the logic there. This is God's idea. Have them both chosen on the same day. Luther was taken away, true Christians, and then Cortez brought them, sort of filled in that gap by making it possible for indigenous people to be Christianized. Persuasion is at the heart of all conquest literature, and this particular heart has been infused with fresh blood for centuries. Yes, there's a less flattering side to the Cortez legend, but it's mostly a modern Mexican phenomenon tied to independence and the revolution, with Cortez as a symbol of colonialism. The negative portrait never upends the legend, because it serves as the reverse side to the same coin. The bold, brilliant strategist is also the cold pragmatist who commits atrocities in the war. The larger-than-life hero is also the womanizer who strangles his first Spanish wife when she objects to the women in his Mexican household. But whether Cortez is hero or villain, an offensive or romantic macho man, his legend still obscures the grim, messy reality of a war in which a dozen Spanish captains and as many Nahua leaders vied for survival and local control. The fact is, Cortez never initiated nor executed a single successful conquest campaign anywhere. For 15 years before the war in Mexico, he was a notary, a failed cattle rancher, and a slave trader in the Caribbean. His reputation was that of a spiteful, duplicitous mediocrity, an example of, quote, all cruel men being cowards, as one Nahua chronicler, Ixtlilxochitl, noted. According to legend, 400 conquistadors conquered the Aztecs, but in reality, close to 3,000 came to Mexico during the war, of whom 2/3 died during it, and a mere handful died decades later of old age in Spain. One of them, Cortez. As this 17th century painting unintentionally suggests, he was a leader who posed rather than fought, who took the limelight, but not the slings and arrows. And what if the conquistador claimed that Mexico was conquered in 1521. That's part of what our quincentennial is about, right? Well, that too was pure spin. The conquest began in 1521. In the 1520s, New Spain existed in name only. The new settlers were few and bitterly divided. The Aztec Empire was largely still intact, now centered on Texcoco, a city that sat on the banks of the lake, not in the middle of it. Its king, Ixtlilxochitl, the grandfather of the Nahua chronicler I just mentioned, had used the war to displace Tenochtitlan's dominance of the imperial alliance. On the other side of the great volcanoes, Tlaxcala had similarly carved out some imperial space of its own. Only over many decades would the surviving members of the Aztec royal family rebuild Tenochtitlan as Mexico City and collude with Spanish settler government to stitch the old empire back together and expand its reach across Mesoamerica as the old Aztec Empire gradually turned into the Kingdom of New Spain. So Cortez's control in the 1520s was an illusion. He was obliged to mimic Montezuma, to play the role of his successor, complete with a court and household staffed with captive and subordinated women, including Malintzin, and women who'd been part of Montezuma's household. One was the emperor's senior daughter, Tecuichpo Ixcaxochitzin, christened Doña Isabel Moctezuma, briefly married to both of her father's successors, Cuitlahuac and Cuauhtemoc, then transferred to Cortez in 1521 as if he were next in line to the throne, mere booty to be gifted. Despite being formally married to a series of Spaniards, she bore Cortez a child, evidence that he lived, as one of his enemies said, like a heathen, not a Christian, meaning like an Aztec. Certainly, in the chaos of the 1520s, Cortez had to act as that Montezuma impersonator, but his accuser was wrong. Doña Isabel's pregnancy, like Malintzin's, was evidence that he was no different from the other Christian men whose raping, enslaving, and slaughtering defined the wars of invasion and colonization in the Americas. So where does that leave our understanding of Montezuma himself? In the traditional narrative, the emperor is so unnerved by the Spaniards, by the seeming relevance of the Quetzalcoatl prophecy, that he panics and surrenders. As the Cortez legend developed, so did Montezuma's reputation as a cowardly failure whose surrender legitimized Spanish conquest and reflected the superstitious, barbaric weakness of the emperor and the civilization that produced him. For 5 centuries, historians have been judging Montezuma as timorous, cowardly, deluded, and foolish. Yet Montezuma also seemed to be the powerful, authoritarian ruler of an aggressively expanding empire, willing to lead armies and execute captives with his own hands. See, he thus became a kind of nonsensical contradiction, one that defied visual representation. There's a series of portraits that tell us nothing about Montezuma, but tell us a lot about how he was being perceived in the decades and centuries in different parts of the European and Euro-American world. He was a monster and a ritual murderer, or he was a pathetic figure compared here to the saintly Las Casas, and here we have Cortez the killer. From the Biblioteca del Niño Mexicano, so these are books about Mexican history designed for Mexican children at the end of the 19th century. Despite the more sophisticated understanding of the Aztecs that has developed in recent decades, the prevailing view since the 1520s has been to see Aztec culture as a dark, bloodthirsty one, tainted by superstition, violence, even cannibalism. This is still, I believe, the best-selling book in the English language on the Aztecs. Montezuma has been tarnished with the same brush. So clearly, we must see Montezuma and Aztec civilization differently. And it can be done by looking afresh at old evidence, as a wide array of scholars in Mexico and elsewhere have been doing. I suggest it's crucially important to transform our perception of the Aztecs, and by extension, all indigenous societies, as I suspect there may be a direct, racist perhaps, neo-colonialist certainly, connection between prejudicial views of the indigenous past and systematic mistreatment of indigenous peoples today. Right, so that last section began the poser, ... and the collector. All right, so let us end and get back to that tiger by returning to the Nuremberg map of Tenochtitlan. And despite the stylized way in which it represents Montezuma's vast royal compounds, one can see evidence of his network of palaces, gardens, museums, and zoos. Inside the red box, it's written in Latin, House of Animals. In cages, courtyards, and buildings designed to facilitate observation and study, the emperor kept artifacts of all kinds from across the empire, from weaponry to textiles to featherwork. A crew of gardeners tended plants and herbs organized by category, and a set of zoos held reptiles, songbirds, and birds of prey, mammals of all kinds, including human beings with genetic deformities. Here was a culture obsessed not with violence and death, but with the ways in which order might be imposed on the disorder of life. Here was an emperor preoccupied not with cutting out hearts, but with acquiring, organizing, and observing the natural life forms and objects of the world he ruled. In other words, Montezuma was a collector. The key to his worldview was not the blood-drenched altar at the top of the pyramid temple of the war god Huitzilopochtli, but the zoological complex that was spread across his royal compound. So if Montezuma did not surrender to the Aztecs, why did he welcome them into Tenochtitlan? Because he was the undisputed ruler of his universe, a king deeply steeped in the rules of ritual and etiquette, obliged to welcome the foreigners with a speech that was concomitant with forms of Nahuatl address, appropriate to Montezuma's imperial status and the formality of the event. We can understand what Montezuma might have said by studying the classical Nahuatl texts preserved in the early colonial period, records of how the language was spoken in his day. The circumstance of this meeting required an elaborate, reverential, gracious, self-deprecating speech of welcome. The purpose of Montezuma's speech was to ritually display the emperor's majesty, to reassure the Spaniards that they were guests, that they were not new acquisitions to his collection. Because, of course, acquisitions is what they really were. As a collector, the emperor sought to add Cortes and his compatriots to his zoo. His strategy was designed to control the Spaniards, weaken but not destroy them or drive them away, to draw them into the city so that they could be collected. Montezuma was not afraid of the invaders. He was hunting them. Once acquired, they were housed within the royal compound in the palace of the emperor's predecessor, adjacent to the other collection sites. And over the next 6 months, Montezuma treated the Spaniards as if they were the newest and most interesting acquisition in his zoo. He displayed them, observed them, learned from them. Where he miscalculated was in not realizing that he was arguably more civilized than they were. Like his lions and tigers, Montezuma's Spaniards couldn't really be tamed. They would eventually turn on their zookeeper, humiliate and murder him, and lay the foundation for 5 centuries of disrespect. The zoos, meanwhile, were destroyed during the 1521 siege of Tenochtitlan. On one of the larger zoo sites, a vast Franciscan convent complex was laid out, and a handful of its structures still survive. So the block that you see extending there from the Torre Latinoamericana, which can be built that high, at one point the tallest building in Latin America, because that was the edge of the island. Where you see all those cars is where the lake was. And that is one of the few buildings on the right there still standing from the Franciscan convent. But that whole block is only a quarter of the size of what was one of the zoos, and there was then this Franciscan compound. So go back exactly 500 years, right? And here, this is a city that is sort of partially in ruin and being rebuilt. And it's a natural location for the Franciscans to pick sort of what's left of that zoo. The ponds and orchards were resurrected. Animals were replaced by small livestock. The exotic fauna reduced or scattered, as we heard at the beginning, even as far as Spain. One wonders, would the Nahua servants and slaves who toiled where the zoo once flourished have seen their world as marked more by continuity or by change. And one wonders too what Aztecs would have made of the Spanish village of Castilleja de la Cuesta, had they been able to visit it as I did some years ago. Well, Cortes died there in 1547, but I looked in vain for any commemorative plaque or monument, finding only in a local bar this evidence of the impact of the conquistador and his encounter with the Aztec emperor. I wished I'd had a few Aztec warriors with me to tell me their version of the meeting of November the 8th, 1519, while together we dropped €1 coins into the machine, hoping they would win us Montezuma's legendary missing treasure. Better yet, I wish I could talk to some of the Aztecs who sailed as slaves to Spain in 1527 to ask them what they thought of Montezuma's zoo, of its destruction by the Spaniards, and to ask them, whatever happened to that poor tiger? Thank you.
Okay, we're going to start a question and answer period right now. We have 2 microphones on each side of the room. Graduate students who are happy to run to you so you can pose your question, so you've heard, more or less. And yeah, it should be quite interesting. Yeah.
It should be quite interesting, he says. Very English.
Okay. I'm so used to talking to an audience, but obviously I'm used to looking at the podium. There's various reasons why the Aztecs fell to the Spanish in 1521, and they range from disease to allies that the Spanish had, enlarging their army, better weaponry. So I'm wondering, what do you think about the Aztec fall in 1521 and the primary reasons that they did fall to the Spanish?
Yeah, you realize that there's Professor Dwyer just asked this sort of absurdly huge question, right? Took another hour. Now I'm going to be standing here talking to answer that question. You know, let me answer that question with a little fact that I make a big deal of in some different kind of versions of when I'm talking about this project. And that is that in August of 1521, when the siege of Tenochtitlan came to a conclusion, when the besiegers overran the final holdout corner of that island city, that besieging force, depicted in so many written and visual representations, you saw some of them during my talk, as being depicted traditionally as being Spaniards. Here you see Spaniards on horseback. Here's the Spanish cavalry going down the causeways to the island. In reality, that besieging force was approximately 1% Spanish. 1%. It may even have been so less than 1%. So who were all the other people? I mean, there was maybe another kind of percentage or two who were non-Spanish and not Nahuas. Taino, who had been brought as slaves and servants by Spaniards from the Caribbean. People of African descent, some African slaves, free Africans. People who were Mesoamericans but not Nahuas, so Totonacs from the coast and so on. So it's like all of those folks would have outnumbered the Spaniards, been another 1 or 2%. So what's that, this 97%? These are people, all of whom were, in the way we categorize the Aztecs, they were Aztecs. So as soon as you kind of throw that out, right, it sort of doesn't make sense. But in not making sense, to make that nonsensical fact kind of become sensible, it obliges you to completely rethink the whole war that led up to that siege. So if those are Aztecs attacking, wait, but isn't it the Aztec Empire that's falling? So what's happening is that the arrival of Spaniards in central Mexico has completely destabilized the political arrangement that existed. And within that kind of chaos that ensues, key local actors, so leaders of local city-states, are jostling against each other and attempting to use the Spaniards as weapons to strengthen their position in central Mexico. But we haven't been told that story. The story we've been presented is the story that was told by the Spaniards, that obviously is completely centered on the Spaniards, and is then within that centered on Cortez. And so the work that we have to do to to rethink it is so massive. And every time we start to do it, we kind of run up against this traditional narrative. And I had the same problem myself. Look, I just wrote this fat book trying to convince people that the best way to understand this war is to pretend Cortez wasn't there, to accept that he did not control and guide the entire thing. And yet, he's on the cover. His name is on the title of the book. He appears on it. He appears more than anybody else, right? So in a sense, I kind of failed at that task. But at least it's like I threw a glove down. Let's have somebody else come along and have another go at revising this history and writing it in a different way without Cortez there. I do it at if you can make it through the hundreds and hundreds of pages, near the end of the book, there's a few pages where I say, I'm now going to tell you the story yet again, because it's not a book that is written as a narrative from beginning to end on purpose. It tells the story multiple times. Near the end, I said, let's tell the story and pretend Cortez didn't exist. He's not going to be mentioned now, and see how it kind of can make sense. And it does. It starts to make sense, but it's not a nice, simple, tidy narrative. I had a conversation with some folks who are making a television series that was going to be on Netflix about this. They wanted to use the title of the book, When Montezuma Met Cortez. No, they didn't do it, and so I didn't drive out here in a Lamborghini as a result. And it got to the point where I said, all I want is just use the title. It's okay. You don't have to use any of the words inside the book, because that's not that they didn't want to use any of that, right? Because the story that has been handed down and is in all the books is more or less familiar is very cinematic. It makes for great fiction, because it is fiction. The real story is really messy and really kind of complicated. And how do you depict that siege? I mean, actually, I think if you do a Netflix-style series with, hour-long episodes and make it last as long as Game of Thrones, hours and hours and hours, then maybe you can do it. Let's start with the siege and really kind of blow everyone's minds by saying, there's hardly any Spaniards. Right? And there are tens of thousands of indigenous warriors. What the heck is going on? And then kind of to go back and say, okay, this is how this empire was structured. This city, Tenochtitlan, in the middle of the lake, was one of 3 cities. And they were really ranked 1, 2, 3. The number 2 city is Texcoco on the bank. And they can see each other across the lake. And they're about the same size. They have about 60,000 people each, which at that time was massive. Largest cities in the Americas, almost no, maybe Paris was that size, but we're talking about the 15th century. There's no cities like that kind of size in Europe. So here they two looking at each other, and they're the same people. They speak the same language. They are ethnically the same. They are interrelated. They're cousins. They're brothers, right? This is really a civil war like the American Civil War. You will know these stories in the American Civil War where there are brothers that end up fighting against each other. That's exactly what happened in this war. There are brothers who are forced to take sides. And as a result, Texcoco emerges as victorious and Tenochtitlan is destroyed. So I'm telling you it's very complicated, and then I'm giving you these kind of bumper stickers, simple ways of thinking about it. But to kind of end the answer to your question, that's one way of thinking about it. Just imagine that it is the number 2 city has defeated the number 1 city to itself become the number 1. And it used the Spaniards to do it. And in order to do it, it had to sacrifice almost all of the empire on the other side of the volcanoes, where Tlaxcala is. And if we were to go back to, say, 1525, that's exactly what it would look like. Ixtlilxochitl is ruling Texcoco. He beats out his brothers in a succession dispute. He defeats the Mexica on Tenochtitlan. He manipulates the Spaniards. He makes his city the base of the siege. I mean, his success in manipulating the war is extraordinary. And long after, Cortez has been denied the governorship and goes back to Spain and so on, Ixtlilxochitl is ruling in Texcoco, and then he passes his kingdom on to his son and so on. And you have to go through generations and go through to the end of the century, into the 17th century, to be able to see, yeah, so in the short run, that's what happened. In the long run, this is now the Kingdom of New Spain. And all the resources are now being funneled into the Spanish Empire. And our perspective through the 300 years of colonial rule, right, is completely distorted what happens back in 1521. And I understand it's really hard, of course. How can we get rid of that 500 years and see it the way it really was? We can't. And as you saw in what I'm talking about, the only way I can do it is to actually go into that 500 years and jump all around. Look at the US Capitol. Like, has that got anything to do with it? Yes, that's why. Those are all the filters. We have to become familiar with them. The Vivaldi opera, Montezuma, is another. I took that out, can't put everything in, but that's another very kind of vivid way of seeing where these filters are, because everybody knows Vivaldi, right? Maybe everybody doesn't know Vivaldi. Okay, I'll take that back. Everybody knows Neil Young. Maybe not so much, all right? Like, who is this weird English guy with his Neil Young and his Vivaldi references? They're so obscure. Yes?
Hi. So you mentioned that the myth is that there were 400 Spaniards sieging Tenochtitlan, much like there were just 300 Spartans fighting the Persians. What role did the technological difference between the Spaniards and their native allies and Aztec enemies play in the war, if at all?
Yeah, that's a good question and a really common question. So before I answer that, why is it such a common question? Because we love the technology, because of the world in which we live. I mean, look, how awesome is this? This is an amazing device, right? And so when we think back 500 years, we have this tendency to latch onto any kind of technological advantages and evidence of technological superiority that there may be. And it's not just because we love our iPhones. We are heirs to a cultural legacy that is now global, that goes all the way back to this time period. This era, early 16th century, it really goes back into the late medieval period, is when there was this kind of an obsession with devices and technology and what it could do and how it could be improved and so on. So the Spaniards were very, very taken by their own technological achievements and superiority. Not so much in 1519 to 1521, but as the decades passed and changes happened, right? So just take, for example, guns. So the guns in 1521 were crap. They were useless. They actually weren't really guns. I mean, they were a crappy little cannon, which the Spaniards did manage to get to Mexico, but they weren't particularly useful. They were kind of like, they were a nice display item, right? Look, we can shoot a cannonball and make a tree go in too, but did they actually change the outcome of any kind of military encounters? No. And as for guns, there were no handguns. Muskets hadn't yet been invented. So, the arquebus is like this long. It takes about 3 minutes to put one bullet in, and that's if your powder is dry, which it probably isn't because you're in the tropics. So, as Vargas Machuca, who's a very grumpy conquistador veteran who wrote a book at the end of the century on how to combat indigenous guerrillas, he's the guy who actually coined that term, said, even in 1599, when there was enormous advances in the making of European weaponry, actually, and not just European at that point, the Japanese were making advances in these kinds of technology. So the best thing you can do with a gun is hold it by the barrel and use it as a club. So it's just, it's too inefficient, it's too unreliable, it takes too long to load. By that point, you've got you have indigenous warriors swarming all over you, cutting you. If we're in an Aztec battle, cutting you with obsidian blades, and those cuts would cause infections. So most of the conquistadors who die, I said there were actually about 3,000 Spaniards who came to Mexico during the 2-year war, and about 2/3 of them died. The vast majority of them died of infections from those kinds of cuts, because they're still, unfortunately for them, about, 400 years away from the discovery of penicillin. So guns are useless. I mean, if you want to say, look, the Spaniards had ocean-going vessels, and that's why they're there, and the Aztecs didn't have ocean-going vessels, and that's why they're not invading Spain, and therefore, I mean, you understand probably that argument, and you also kind of understand how reductionist it is, right? And that only makes sense if it's predicated on the acceptance that, well, what is always good is to use technology to travel to other people's countries and slaughter them and enslave them and take their territory, right? And if we're accepting that that's a good thing, which may have been the case in 1521, but I think is not the case in 2021. As soon as you take that away, then that doesn't really, it's not a question of superiority or an advantage, right? I am very suspicious of any of these arguments about technological superiority. And I particularly get suspicious because of the way in which so many of them are misused. I mean, okay, poor old Jared Diamond. So yes, it seems like sour grapes because, Guns, Germs, and Steel is sold many, many more copies than all of my books. I recognize that. And the book has some, enormous virtues to it. Do I wish I'd written the book? Well, kind of, but I would have written a different book that would have been, to my mind, more accurate, and of course would have sold 5% as many copies. But what does Jared Diamond do? He argues that one of the advantages that Spaniards have in the New World is that they have literacy. So they can communicate they have writing. And the poor, less advanced Indians don't have writing. And then the example he uses is Peru. Okay, so there's so many problems here. First of all, in the Andes, they do have a very efficient system of communication using quipu. So pieces of string that we now understand were far more varied and sophisticated than the Spaniards possibly could have understood at the time. So what animal or plant the string is taken from communicates something, the color that it is dyed, the number of knots, where it's located. I mean, as soon as you look into all these variables, you realize it's potentially a system of communication that's just as not necessarily as efficient, but just as effective as any other, whether it's Maya hieroglyphs or the alphabet that we still use. But what Jared Diamond doesn't do is pay any attention to Mesoamerica, where there is an amazing system of communication writing. Right? The Maya hieroglyph system is astonishingly sophisticated and can be used to communicate absolutely. You could translate Shakespeare's plays into Maya hieroglyphs if you really want. And I always like to say that, hoping that someone will say, actually, we're doing that in our Duquesne, language course of 598. We're translating Shakespeare into Maya hieroglyphs. So that's why I'm very suspicious. Whether we're talking about guns, horses, don't get me started on horses as well. Horses are no use unless you have open plains in which to use cavalry, blah, blah, blah. So all of these things, when you actually look at them in detail, start to kind of fall apart. The only thing that really does make a difference is steel, iron and steel. But only if you're assuming that, let's go back to Professor Dwyer's question here. At the siege of Tenochtitlan, you've got an army of Spanish soldiers with steel swords battling against Aztec defenders who don't have steel and they lose. But when you understand that they're only 1% of the attackers, then how does the steel sword make any difference? And then, of course, all those Spaniards who die in the course of the siege, at one point, there's an attacking force of 70 Spaniards, and they don't say how many indigenous warriors were with them, but probably something around 1,000 get cut off by Mexica defenders, and they all get captured, and they all get killed. And what the Aztecs do is they march them up to the top of the pyramid, and then they execute them at the top of the pyramid because they know that the Spaniards and all of their allies can see that, right? And it has a very effective demoralizing effect. And tens of thousands of besiegers leave, and they go back to their hometowns. And the whole siege slows down for a whole month until more Spaniards arrive from Cuba and arrive on the coast and work their way back up, and then the kind of the tide turns again. But those 70 Spaniards who are captured and executed, what happens to any steel swords or daggers that they have? They're being used by the defenders, right? So much for that advantage, right? I do have a tendency to talk way too long in answering questions because obviously I love this topic, so I'm just going to stop dead.
Hello.
Yes, hi.
I was quite interested in the concept of gendered imperialism, particularly in the depiction of indigenous women. Would you say that was intentionally misogynistic, or perhaps while trying to glorify the Spaniards, it was sort of incidentally misogynistic?
Wait, who was being misogynistic, or what is the question about who was being misogynistic? The images or the textual descriptions?
Either or both, and perhaps you could talk a little bit more about the idea of gendered imperialism in general.
Yeah, this is an aspect of the project that I came to fairly late on in the creation of it, and there's the final chapter in the book is when I talk about that kind of stuff. It's when I kind of address this issue of whether this was genocidal or not, which I thought was, for most of the time I was working on this, I thought that was completely inappropriate kind of term. For most of the time I thought the way in which the Malinche-Cortez relationship has become seen as a romance was not really relevant. And there's an enormous amount of investment in Mexico in seeing it that way. And I didn't want to offend people. We were kind of talking about this when we had a sort of discussion section with graduate students earlier, that it seemed to me that if Mexicans want to believe that Malinche and Cortez had a genuine romance, and for me to come along and say, it was so far from that the reality of it is really deeply disturbing, with this girl who's 12 years old, who's made into a slave, and here's this guy 20 years older, and he's got children by all of these different women, including his first child is by a Taino woman who he enslaves and keeps in his household in Cuba, and so on. And how this kind of, it just goes out from there to this sort of pattern. I thought this is too much. I don't want to get into this. And if Mexicans want to believe the birth of their nation isn't one of it's this horrific rape, but it's of love and romance, then who the heck am I, a non-Mexican, to come in and tell them different, right? That's like I felt like it was really offensive of me to do that. But then the more I started thinking about it, and the more I sort of went down that road and started looking at evidence of what happened, and the topic of indigenous slavery or the enslavement of indigenous peoples is kind of a wave in the history of colonial Latin America right now. There's a lot of new studies, so there were new doctoral dissertations coming out showing just how extensive that practice was in the Caribbean and in Mexico. And I thought, maybe I do need to kind of include that. And I have some people react to that last chapter saying, oh, this is the best chapter in the book because there's like, you're passionate in here. And people who know me is like, yeah, I'm a guy who has 4 daughters. So it's like becomes kind of personal, right? And then there are other people who say, yeah, that kind of passion, that sort of personal involvement doesn't really have a place in a study like this. You should be more dispassionate and objective. And that's actually the worst chapter. So I have kind of mixed feelings about it. That's not really what you asked. I mean, what you really wanted me to do is to give you kind of a more sophisticated summary of that using gender theory, and I'm not good at that. I know enough about it to know that I don't articulate it as well as other people might, right? I'll say this about that there's one image that I put several times on there that accompanies the account in the 1750s. It's in French, the one I had up there, but that image is repeated over and over and over. Sometimes you see it flipped because of the way that these engravings are reused and copied in the early modern period. It's a very common engraving, which means that of people who read these kinds of accounts, who sort of, were exposed to this history, an enormous percentage of them saw that image of civilization and barbarism, right? And the way in which it is presented with Malinche and the other young women as really young and naked, being presented to the conquistadors, but it's not presented in a negative way, right? And there's a kind of a blurb that goes with it that suggests that right from that very moment, Cortez looks at Malinche and is like, ooh, I like that one. She's the pretty one. And that she looks at him and has the same kind of reaction, right? So here you have a scene which from our sensibilities, when you look at that picture, it just looks disturbing right from the beginning. It's like, there's sort of vaguely pornographic, and it's just very kind of unsettling. And yet in the 18th century, we have to accept that the vast majority of people who looked at it didn't see it as unsettling. And that's a kind of midpoint between the events we're talking about and today. Right in that midpoint, something like that can be visually presented that way. There can be that kind of text. On the assumption that the reader is going to not question that, not see that as upsetting, as of course, And how do we make sense of that? Because only if we accept that everybody buys into this notion that human beings are organized into these hierarchies that are determined by race and gender. They're just Indian girls, right? Like, that's the kind of idea. Is that really that long ago? I don't think it is. I don't think we can look back and say, oh, things have changed so much since the 1750s. No one today would ever, abuse, a young woman like that just because she was indigenous. Unfortunately, that is so totally not the case, right? And that's where I think I suggested somewhere in here that there are these connections, which is not what I'm doing in the book. I'm just kind of like, look, I'm not rewriting this. Well, there I just said it. I'm rewriting the history. That's what we do, right? Making it all up ourselves. I'm writing the revisionist history. Well, history is revisionist, but there's certain kind of pointers in there. Like, okay, pick this up and run with this and see if it has some validity and see if it goes somewhere or not. I might be wrong, right? That's the stop point. As you can tell, I can just keep going. Yes?
Hi. In our Mexican history course here, we read The Broken Spears, and forget the author's name, but the author described how indigenous accounts were largely left out of written histories, and I'm wondering if you still see that occurring today in Mexican history.
Yeah, that's Miguel León Portilla, who just died. He was sort of the senior figure in senior Mexican historian, anthropologist, and so on. That is a really important book, both in Spanish, its original Spanish in Mexico, and in its English version. And he's kind of a towering figure, and so one has to be, I think, respectful of that and in how one treats the book. For me, the problem with the book now, I think it's not fair to say that this was a problem with the book when it was first came out in the 1960s. This is how old this book is that it essentializes the Nahua perspective. So what it does is it takes different Nahua texts that were written in the colonial period and kind of shuffles them around to create a Nahua or Aztec account of the conquest. And in doing so, it really kind of invents something. And that book has helped to kind of obscure our ability to re-understand or re-look at, retell this story in a way that makes sense of the siege being carried out 99% by indigenous people, right? So that fact right there up against the broken spears, those two things don't really make sense. And they don't really make sense because the way in which the broken spears is constructed. If you want to go to a different book in which you will see those Nahuatl texts presented in transcriptions, you can see the Nahuatl original transcribed with translations of those texts in a way that they're not shuffled around, that they're kind of, the identity of those texts is respected. So it's very clear to you exactly when they were written, who wrote them, how many years after the conquest it was, what their particular perspective is. You can, there was a book written by a professor at UCLA who was one of my professors that came out in the 1990s, but no one's read that book because this was an academic who was speaking to other academics, and it was published in a kind of an obscure paperback, hardback, and the reason why the Broken Spears is so important is because it's marketed and packaged in the right way. And that's why it's still used in the classroom. It's affordable. It's relatively short. There's 1 million used copies, and there's perfectly nice looking new ones. So, I mean, these things matter, right? If you want to change people's perception, you have to kind of think about the packaging. But then the last thing I'll say about that is also, the thing about the Broken Spears is it goes against a traditional narrative, but it tells an equally simple story, right? And it's a predictable one, which is, how would you think the Aztecs are going to feel? They're going to feel distraught. And, like, as it says, broken spears, which actually is, by the way, a mistranslation. The accurate translation of that phrase in is broken bones, which I think is a even better phrase. But it's going to be a story about suffering and loss. That's kind of what you want, and that's the way that these texts are arranged in the Broken Spears, so you kind of get that story. To arrange them properly, the story isn't so simple. It becomes complicated, and now you don't know who to blame, right? And people get confused by that. It would mean like a civil war. Oh, so now we don't feel bad for the Aztecs because they did it to themselves? Like, no, you can't keep reducing the story back to a nice, simple narrative that can fit in like a 2-hour Hollywood movie, right? You've got to think of it as, I don't know why I keep mentioning the Game of Thrones. How many episodes was the Game of Thrones in total? I know that someone in here knows off. What? 77? I knew that. I knew it was this guy with the beard. Would know that. That's what you need. And they're about an hour each, right? It's what you need, 77 hours. In 77 hours, if someone would pay me to make that series, that would answer your question. You'd say, okay, I get it now. Broken Spears is great, but sorry, Miguel Leon Portilla. This is being live streamed, right? So I'm in huge trouble now. I mean, I'd try to give him his due and his respect. If he hadn't done that, I wouldn't be able to stand here to be kind of arguing against it, right?
Good evening. I wanted to see about an answer about the whole 99% of indigenous fighters that accompanied the Spanish. Were those primarily like the vassal client states of Moctezuma? And if any reason besides what you mentioned about Texcoco, was there any other motivation, like has it been documented, heavy taxation, heavier human sacrifice, or is that just a gross colonial misconception to demonize the indigenous people?
Well, you answered your question.
Damn.
Okay, so you kind of had me thinking a certain way until you said human sacrifice. So that is like that's a red flag for me. Now I'm like coming right at you, right? So I have a huge problem with that phrase, human sacrifice. Why is Aztec ritual execution human sacrifice? But what the Spaniards did, what the English are doing, that's not human sacrifice? So what we're talking about is the ritual execution of someone for sort of political, religious reasons, right? But meanwhile, in England, if you're the wrong kind of Christian, you're being burned alive at the stake. Not even a different religion. They're still all Christians. It's like, oh no, you said the wrong things within our religion, and now we're going to tie you to a wooden post in public, ritually humiliate you, and then burn you alive. Effectively torture you to death. But that's not human sacrifice? So it is a totally loaded term. It's colonialist, it's racist, and it is so deeply entrenched. I guarantee if we could get a room full of people who study this kind of thing, let's get anthropologists and art historians and so on, we get people from Germany and Canada and the US and Mexico and so on, I would be in the minority. That they would be like, no, yeah, we understand what you're saying, Matthew, but you're just going too far because look, and then they would get into all of the details of, oh, but they did this and they did that. I would really encourage you to kind of think about how that term is used. And once you throw that term out and understand or try to see the world, the 16th century world as being one in which in all societies, people are ritually, publicly executed for crimes that may be crimes, that we would think of as perfectly normal criminal things like murder and so on, for political reasons, religious reasons, war captives. And there are different ways in which they are killed. You don't just simply kill someone, you do it in different ways. And the Aztecs had their own culture of that. And what the Aztecs would have argued is, we have way more respect for human life than these Castilians and the Spaniards. Because they just slaughter people indiscriminately. We attempt to capture people on the battlefield so that we can kill them in a way that is more respectful of human life. The Spaniards are like, respectful of human life? You were holding them prisoner, sometimes for a year, and then these like grim things where you're cutting out the heart and you're flaying them and so on. Yes, but they're just different ways of killing people, right? So that's the first thing, is what are the Europeans doing? And what are the Europeans continuing to do for hundreds of years? I mean, there are some people that will go sort of, well, let's talk about, World War II and pogroms and Holocausts and atom bombs and so on. I think that's going a little bit too far. I think we just stick to the first half of the 16th century and the job is done right there. That's the first thing. Second thing is, okay, so the Aztecs are ritually executing people. How many people are they really killing? So there's, just as the traditional narrative has these little lies that become these huge lies, like the idea that Montezuma surrendered to Cortez, so in the study of the Aztecs are these little ideas that go all the way back to the 16th century, for which there is no evidence at all, that are developed by Spaniards, particularly certain Franciscans, who have a reason for doing it, right? That they are trying to destroy a religious culture in order to replace it with a different one. And they simply throw out these ideas like, oh, they were sacrificing on their pyramids 20,000 children a year. You can trace those numbers. There's no evidence of anything like that at all, right? But you can, and if that was true, you would have a population being decimated. It's actually totally ludicrous. But these numbers get traced through the historiography all the way until we get up to the 20th century, where people are saying, now let's calculate how many people you could kill in the course of a day. So, there's supposed to be the coronation of Ahuitzotl, who was one of the Aztec emperors in the 15th century, and supposedly that 64,000 people were sacrificed to commemorate his coronation, for which that fact has absolutely no evidence whatsoever, except a Spaniard saying it over 100 years later, right? But then we come to the 20th century and someone's like, okay, I'm gonna figure this out. So how long does it take somebody to walk up the steps of the pyramid? How long does it take for the priest to cut the heart out? we're going to like treat this as a very kind of scientific problem, and they come up and they say, yep, it could be done. You could actually kill 63,427 people that way, as opposed to going all the way back and questioning the source, right? Why don't they do that? Because it's part of the traditional narrative that nobody wants to question. Once you start questioning that, it's a kind of a domino effect, right? All the people who've written brilliant books about human sacrifice are not going to be happy with somebody like me saying the phrase human sacrifice is offensive and wrong, and behind it lies a colossal misunderstanding of Aztec civilization. Am I right or am I wrong? You're young enough that you'll live to see 20 or 30 years from now. You say, that weird guy who came and spoke when I was at Duquesne, it turned out that he was totally wrong. They found all this archaeological evidence. Yeah, they keep finding skulls in the archaeological project in Mexico City. And every time they find skulls, they get all excited, saying, see? And I say, okay, how about let's dig up Paris? You know, anyone been to Paris? Anyone been underneath Paris? Thousands and thousands of skulls. How did all those skulls get there? Well, that's where they put dead people. They weren't sacrificed. They died. And then their bones are put in these caves underneath the city. But we know that, right? Because there hasn't been an event that has covered up the history, that has rewritten the history. It's kind of obscured it. So that's what's happened with the Aztecs. We have to kind of rescue them. I'm not saying they're like any better than the Spaniards, but they're not any worse. I'm not saying they're any better than the English or any worse. They're not us. It's a different time period. But they have consistently been depicted for 500 years as being the worst of the worst. They're kind of the poster children for like barbarism. And I think it's completely and utterly wrong. I think that we could just as easily, say, look, let's talk about 16th century England and forget Shakespeare and all of that. And let's just depict the English entirely. It's all about Henry VIII and all the terrible things he did to his wives and the burning of people alive at the stake and the fact that people didn't wash once a year. And let's just think of all the horrible things. You could totally depict 16th century England in just as bad or worse a way as the way in which the Aztecs have been depicted. But instead, for obvious reasons I don't have to explain to you, and instead what you're fed is something totally different, right? I feel like I answered about 7 questions you didn't ask, but anyway, thank you for that. Thank you.
Please